The story of Elijah is one of the most intense and fascinating in the Bible. He is not just a prophet, but a mysterious and radical figure who challenges the authorities and faces immense power in the name of faith. But do you really know the story of Elijah? The one that goes beyond great victories and miracles? Today, we will explore the life of this man who, even in the face of the cruelest threats, never lost his faith. Get ready for a journey that will reveal Elijah as you have never seen him before. From the moment he appears in the scriptures, Elijah provokes a reaction. He appears suddenly without warning with a clear and direct message. The people of Israel had strayed from the truth. His story is marked by moments of great courage, but also of doubt and suffering. He faces not only kings, but the entire religious and political system of Israel. And it is this internal and external struggle that makes his life a powerful example. And at the same time, a story of redemption. The figure of Elijah, with his firm stance and unshakable trust in God, is often seen as a metaphor for life's challenges. But Elijah also faced great moments of despair, moments when doubt overwhelmed him, when he thought he no longer had the strength to carry on. This is a story that resonates with those who often feel lost or directionless, but find strength where they least expect it. Today, we will uncover the true essence of Elijah, his conflict, his moments of despair, and how, through his faith, he managed to change the destiny of a people. Prepare to be amazed, because Elijah's journey is more than just miracles. It is a journey of internal struggle, resilience, and above all, of a divine power that no one expected. So, are you ready to delve into Elijah's story like never before? Let's start now, and you will see how each step of his journey teaches us lessons of courage, faith, and overcoming, which continue to resonate to this day. Elijah appears in the scriptures in an almost mysterious way, without much explanation. About his origin, he was not chosen by lineage, nor was he surrounded by the powerful of the time. He simply appears, and his mission: to challenge a corrupt system, an entire nation that had turned away from God's ways. He becomes the divine spokesman at a time when the kings of Israel were losing their way and taking the people with them into idolatry. Unlike other prophets who had roots or connections to the court, Elijah was a simple man, but with impressive spiritual authority. His attitude towards power, whether political or religious, was defiant. He was not intimidated by kings like Ahab and Jezebel, and his courage in facing these authority figures was something that stood out throughout his journey. It was as if Elijah was an unstoppable force whose mission was to bring back the truth to a lost people. But what truly defined Elijah was his faithfulness to God. His life was not about fame or power, but about an unwavering commitment to the divine mission. He knew that the task he was given would not be easy, and even when the challenges became almost unbearable, he did not waver. This made his name revered for many generations, but also feared by those who tried to control the people and divert them from the truth. Over the years, many have looked to Elijah as a symbol of spiritual purity, a man who defied the greatest in powers in the world and paid the price for it. His courage became legendary, but so did his inner struggle. Elijah was not an unbeatable man. He felt fear, doubt, and exhaustion. However, his relationship with God was what sustained him, and this made him a unique prophet with a unique mission. His story, marked by dramatic moments and divine revelations, extends far beyond his victories. It is, in fact, a reflection of the struggle between faith and adversity, between light and darkness. When we think of Elijah, we think of someone who was more than just a prophet. He was a man who, in his humanity, teaches us that true power lies not in physical strength, but in the strength of faith. And that is what we will explore throughout this video. To fully understand Elijah's mission, it is essential to look at the historical context in which he lived. Israel was at a critical moment. The northern kingdom, led by King Ahab, was steeped in idolatry and corruption. Ahab not only married Jezebel, a Phoenician princess devoted to Baal, but he also allowed her to introduce Baal worship into Israel, a grave sin according to God's laws. The nation was at a point of spiritual collapse, and the people of Israel were drifting further and further away from the God of their fathers. Elijah appears in this scenario as a voice of warning, a beacon of truth in the midst of an age of spiritual darkness. King Ahab was weak and easily manipulated by his wife Jezebel, and together they not only allowed but encouraged the worship of false gods. The situation became so serious that God himself commanded Elijah to prophesy the drought that would ravage the land as a sign of judgment. The drought was not just a natural disaster, but a divine warning. You have followed other gods, and now you will see the consequences. This period of crisis in the kingdom of Israel is crucial to understanding the magnitude of Elijah's mission. He was not just challenging a king and queen, he was challenging an entire system of beliefs and practices that had infiltrated the hearts of God's people. He was sent to combat the spiritual and political forces that were corrupting Israel. But in doing so, Elijah made himself a target, and his courage in standing up to the established power was extraordinary. The tension was palpable. The people of Israel were divided. Many were being carried away by the current of idolatry, while others were still seeking the true God, but unsure of where to stand. It was a battle of faith, and Elijah, with his boldness and courage, was the leader of this resistance. As we look at the historical backdrop, we realize that Elijah was not just a prophet, but a true revolutionary, a man called to turn the tide of Israel's history. This context leads us to understand that Elijah's mission was not simple. He was fighting against very powerful forces, and the future of a nation was at stake. In times of darkness such as these, prophets become the lights of truth. Elijah not only preached, but took radical action to challenge corruption and restore through worship. His mission, therefore, was not only spiritually urgent, but also of great risk. Elijah's story is one of resilience, courage, and faith at a time when all seemed lost. The first time Elijah confronts Ahab is a defining moment of his entire career as a prophet. Ahab, as king of Israel, was responsible for the spiritual decline of his nation. He and his wife Jezebel had allied themselves with the worship of Baal, and the kingdom of Israel was immersed in sin. Famine and drought were about to devastate the land, and Elijah appeared in Ahab's court with a prophecy that no one was prepared to hear. "There shall be neither dew nor rain, except at my word." This boldness of Elijah came as a shock, not only to Ahab, but to the entire nation. It was a direct challenge to the king, his authority, and the gods he and the people were worshipping. Elijah did not ask permission to speak. He was not intimidated by the royal figure, and the prophecy of drought was a declaration of spiritual war. The message was clear. The land would suffer as a reflection of God's departure, and this would not be resolved until the people repented. Ahab, with his kingly status, probably thought he could ignore Elijah. After all, he had power, wealth, and control of the nation. But Elijah was not concerned with the threats of Ahab or Jezebel. His mission was greater than any threat. When he presented himself to the king, it was not just to deliver a prophecy of judgment, but to show Ahab that the real power was not in his hands, but in God's. The tension was further heightened when Elijah, after delivering his message of judgment, fled to hide by the riverbank, where God provided him with miraculous sustenance through ravens that brought him food. This moment marks the depth of Elijah's commitment to his mission. He was willing to face death, contempt, and the hostility of Ahab and Jezebel because he knew that God's word needed to be proclaimed regardless of the consequences. This first confrontation with Ahab also reveals something crucial about Elijah's mission. He was a man of action. He did not come just to talk. He came to make the people of Israel face the consequences of their mistakes. Elijah was, above all, a man of God, and his courage in defying Ahab and the royal court showed that he had unshakable confidence in the power of the Lord. But what happened next was even more surprising. Elijah was about to face one of the greatest challenges of his life, and the future of Israel would depend on his courage. Mount Carmel became the scene of one of the most epic and intense confrontations in the Bible. After a period of drought, when the people of Israel were still blinded by their idolatry, Elijah challenged the 450 prophets of Baal to a direct confrontation. The challenge was simple. Each side would have to offer a sacrifice to their gods, and the true God would be the one who would send fire from heaven to consume the offering. This was not just a test of divine power, but a matter of life and death. For Elijah, Mount Carmel was transformed into a scene of unparalleled tension. Elijah was defiant and bold in putting his faith in God to the test, knowing that the consequences would be devastating if he failed. The people of Israel were divided, but Elijah, with his unshakable confidence, knew that the moment had come. The confrontation was more than a simple contest of miracles. It was the chance to bring Israel back to the true God, or the nation could succumb to idolatry forever. The prophets of Baal, in turn, prayed and danced around their altar for hours, calling for fire, but nothing happened. The scene that unfolded before the people's eyes was almost tragic. 450 men desperately trying to invoke a God who did not respond. At this point, Elijah could not help but taunt the worshippers of Baal. His courage and boldness reached a point where he began to mock them. "Shout louder. Perhaps Baal is asleep or traveling," he said. Elijah's laughter, even in the face of such tension, is a reflection of his immense faith in the power of God. When his turn came, Elijah did something no one expected. He not only prepared the altar, but he did so with an impressive display of faith. He ordered 4 jars of water to be poured over the sacrifice, an immense amount, knowing that water would make any fire nearly impossible. The act of pouring water on the altar was a symbol that Elijah was completely confident in God's answer. He was not simply asking for a sign, but affirming with his actions that God was the only one capable of doing the impossible. With Elijah's simple and direct prayer, God responded with fire, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water around the altar. The people who watched in silence could not deny the power of Elijah's God. The confrontation on Mount Carmel was a victory not only for Elijah, but for all Israel. It was confirmation that, despite the darkness, God was still in control and capable of bringing salvation. Elijah, with his courage and faith, had restored hope, but the impact of this miracle would extend far beyond that mountain. Mount Carmel was not only the scene of a great miracle, but also the place where the nation of Israel found itself divided between the false god Baal and the true God of Israel. But this victory would not mean the end of Elijah's hardships. In fact, it merely signaled the beginning of a new confrontation with the power of Jezebel, a battle that would be even more personal and challenging for the prophet. What came next would further test Elijah's faith and bring him to a place of great vulnerability. After his overwhelming victory on Mount Carmel, Elijah could have felt invincible. He had defied the prophets of Baal and shown the people of Israel that the true God was more powerful than any idol. But instead of rest, Elijah soon faced one of the most frightening and dark moments of his life. Jezebel, furious at the death of her 450 prophets, sent a message to Elijah promising his death within 24 hours. Fear gripped the prophet, and he, who until then seemed indestructible, fled for his life. Elijah's response to this threat shows the humanity of the prophet. He who had courageously defied the king and queen now found himself on the run, consumed by fear and exhaustion. The tension in Elijah's heart was palpable. He knew he was in mortal danger, but what really shook him was not just the threat of death, but the sense of loneliness and failure. The moment of victory on Carmel now seemed distant. Elijah, who had faced a host of prophets, was now running from a woman who defied him. Elijah's flight took him to the desert, where he sat down under a tree and asked God to let him die. In his heart, Elijah felt defeated. The great miracle on Carmel had not solved Israel's spiritual problems, and he wondered if his mission had been in vain. His despair was so great that he wanted nothing more than to rest, away from all the suffering and struggles he had faced. "It is enough, Lord. Take my life, for I am no better than my fathers," he said, expressing his feelings of failure and deep exhaustion. But in this moment of weakness, God did not abandon Elijah. Instead of punishing or ignoring him, God sent an angel to feed and strengthen him. This divine intervention was more than just a physical provision. It was a reminder to Elijah that his mission was not yet complete. God compassionately treated Elijah's emotional exhaustion, bringing him food and rest, and preparing him for what was to come. This was one of the most delicate moments in Elijah's life, but also one of the most significant, for it showed that even the greatest heroes of faith need moments of healing and renewal. The flight into the desert was not only a physical escape, but also an emotional and spiritual escape. Elijah needed time to get back on his feet, to hear God's voice again, and to understand that the fight was not lost. The story of Elijah teaches us that even the bravest have their weaknesses and moments of discouragement, but God never abandons them. He was about to give Elijah a new direction, something he did not expect, but which would be fundamental to the future of Israel. After the escape and the moment of despair in the desert, Elijah experienced one of the most profound experiences of his life. On Mount Horeb, the same mountain where Moses had received the tablets of the law, Elijah took refuge in a cave. There he expected an answer from God, but the way in which that answer arrived was unexpected. Elijah did not encounter God's presence in the great manifestations he expected, such as the strong wind, the earthquake, or the fire. Instead, God manifested himself in a still, small voice, a whisper that brought clarity to the prophet's mind. This moment was a turning point in Elijah's life. For years, he had faced great battles and tested his faith in extreme ways. However, what he experienced in that moment was a lesson in how God can manifest himself in subtle ways, often invisible to the human eye. God's still voice was not a cry for power, but a call to reflection and trust in his presence, even in the quietest and most intimate circumstances. When Elijah heard that voice, he knew immediately that he was no longer alone. God was directing him, not with overwhelming force, but with an invitation to spiritual renewal. The gentleness of the voice was a contrast to the intensity of the struggles Elijah had faced, and that contrast brought him an unexpected sense of peace. He learned that God is not only present in the greatest victories and moments of glory, but also in the stillness of the loneliest moments. Sometimes God's true guidance comes not in the storms, but in the calms. The still voice brought not only comfort, but also guidance. God instructed Elijah to return to his path and accomplish tasks that still lay ahead, such as anointing new kings and preparing Elisha as his successor. These actions were not only important to Elijah, but to the future of Israel. It was a renewal, of his purpose. The impact of this moment was profound, for Elijah now understood that his journey was not only about defeating his enemies, but also about trusting God in the quietest, most peaceful moments. Elijah finally stood up and followed God's instruction. He understood that God had not abandoned him, but was transforming his vision of how he should fulfill his mission. The wilderness, which had once been a place of despair, now became a place of spiritual renewal. God's whisper in the wilderness became a turning point in Elijah's life, a reminder that true strength is often found in silence, stillness, and trust in God. The transition from Elijah to Elisha was one of the most important and symbolic moments in the prophet's story. God not only gave Elijah a new direction, but also paved the way for the future by calling Elisha to be his successor. Elijah, with his heart already renewed after his experience in the desert, met Elisha, a simple man who was plowing the fields with 12 oxen. The scene was remarkable. Elijah threw his cloak over Elisha, a gesture that symbolized the transfer of God's calling and authority. The moment Elisha was called by Elijah was a moment of transformation. Elisha, in an act of total dedication, left behind his former life and followed God's call. He did not hesitate, demonstrating immediate faith and a willingness to follow the new path that God had for him. By killing the oxen and burning the plow, Elisha was telling the world that his old life was over. He was ready to embrace Elijah's mission without looking back. The relationship between Elijah and Elisha has become one of the most inspiring and symbolic in the biblical context. Elisha was not just a disciple of Elijah, he was someone who had the responsibility to continue the prophet's work. Elijah knew that he would not live forever and that his legacy needed to be passed on. However, this transition was not an easy one. Elijah had to prepare Elisha to face the challenges that he himself had faced, and Elisha's journey would be marked by trials that would test his faith in ways similar to those of his master. When Elijah was about to be taken up to heaven, Elisha demonstrated the greatness of his heart and his faithfulness to the prophet. He refused to leave Elijah, following him every step of the way, right up until the moment when Elijah was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire. The scene of Elijah being taken up to heaven with Elisha watching was one of the most dramatic and moving in biblical history. The moment represented the end of an era and the beginning of a new one, but also the strong bond between master and disciple that would be immortalized by Elisha's continuing mission. Elisha, now wearing the mantle of Elijah, was ready to continue the work. He had not only inherited his master's power, but also the spirit of courage and faithfulness that Elijah possessed. Elijah's legacy was not just a matter of succession, but of continuing God's work on earth, facing the same challenges and obstacles. With Elijah's death and Elisha's rise, the people of Israel knew that the cycle of faith continued. Elijah had fulfilled his mission, but Elisha was now prepared to continue the work that God had begun in both of them. The end of Elijah's journey was as extraordinary as his life. Unlike so many other biblical characters, Elijah did not experience death in the traditional way. Instead, God reserved for him a unique and glorious farewell. As he walked with Elisha, knowing that his time was coming to an end, Elijah remained serene. The heavens were about to open in a way that had never been seen before. The tension of that moment was growing, and Elisha's heart burned with excitement and uncertainty. It was known that something great was about to happen, but no one could have predicted how heavenly it would be. Suddenly, a chariot of fire, drawn by flaming horses, descended from the heavens amid a storm of glory. The thunderous sound, the intense light, and the power that enveloped the scene were indescribable. Elisha, astonished, watched as his master was enveloped by this divine manifestation. There was no pain, there was no crying, only a rapture that united heaven and earth. Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind before the eyes of his disciple. It was the end of an era, not tragically, but triumphantly, as befitted a man who had walked so closely with God. The sight of that chariot of fire was forever etched in Elisha's heart. He tore his clothes in mourning, not out of sadness, but out of reverence for what he had witnessed. Elijah had departed, but he had left much more than just teachings. He had left a spiritual legacy that would never be forgotten. The people of Israel would hear for generations about the prophet who was taken up to heaven without tasting death. Elijah became not only a symbol of faith and courage, but living proof that faithfulness to God has an eternal reward. Elijah's rapture also left a deep mark on the collective imagination. He was no longer just a prophet. He was now a heavenly figure, someone who transcended the limits of human existence. The way God took him was a powerful statement. Elijah had fulfilled his mission, faced kings and false prophets, endured loneliness, and stood firm. He was worthy of being taken straight into the divine presence. It was as if heaven was saying, "This is one of mine." Elijah's physical absence was felt, but his influence never faded. His ascension became a landmark in the Jewish faith and later in the Christian tradition. He would be remembered not only for what he did in life, but for how he departed. God had sealed his story with a supernatural and glorious act, elevating Elijah to the status of an eternal example of obedience and holiness. It was the perfect ending to a journey full of conflicts, miracles, and revelations, but in a way, it was not the end yet. Even after his ascension, Elijah continued to be present in the pages of sacred history, not as a ghost of the past, but as a promise of the future. His name was not forgotten. On the contrary, it became one of the most frequently mentioned when people spoke of the coming of the Messiah. The prophets announced that before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord, Elijah would return to prepare the way. This announcement created an intense and mystical expectation among the people. Elijah, the man who had not seen death, still had a role to play in the divine plan. This prophecy gained strength in New Testament times, when many began to see in John the Baptist the figure of Elijah reincarnated, or at least with the same spirit and purpose. John preached in the desert, dressed in a similar way, and proclaimed the truth with the same courage. Jesus confirmed this connection when he said that Elijah had already come, pointing to John. The mission of confronting, purifying, and preparing hearts was being continued. Elijah, even physically absent, still echoed in each call to repentance. Elijah's symbolic presence runs through the last books of the Bible. In Revelation, there is speculation among scholars about his possible role as one of the two witnesses of the last days, men who would prophesy with power, confront the Antichrist, and be killed only to be resurrected before the world. This idea is not confirmed exactly, but it reinforces how Elijah's role is seen as something still unfinished. His life, then, was not just a chapter in history, but a continuous link between the past, present, and future of faith. Elijah became a symbol of what it means to live intensely for God, radically, wholeheartedly, and unwaveringly. He faced kings and multitudes, walked alone in deserts, heard God's voice in silence, and was lifted up to heaven in glory. His story is not only moving, it is a call to true faith, to courage in the face of evil, and to trust in God's purposes even when we don't understand the way. And so the story of Elijah ends, or perhaps just begins, Because men like Elijah don't die. They become eternal, eternal in their deeds, in their influence, and in the hope that when the world needs a prophetic voice again, he or someone like him will be there, ready to cry out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. And if you thought Elijah's story was amazing, just wait until you see what comes next. In the next video, we'll dive into the journey of Elisha, Elijah's successor, and discover how he inherited a mantle of power and performed even more amazing miracles. So subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and come with me on this journey, because the next part of this story will leave you speechless.